You've been measuring spiritual alignment all wrong. The meditation apps, the manifestation journals, the gratitude practices. Jung would tell you that none of these tell you whether you're actually aligned or just performing alignment. Because what the spiritual marketplace calls alignment is often just another sophisticated way to avoid the psychological truth of where you actually are. And the real markers of genuine alignment that Jung discovered, they look nothing like what's being sold to you. Carl Jung spent decades studying people who claimed to be spiritually aligned versus those who actually were. And what he found was disturbing. Most people measuring their alignment by how peaceful they felt, how positive their thoughts were, how high vibe their energy seemed. These people were often the most misaligned Jung encountered. They'd created a spiritual persona that looked aligned while their actual psyche was fragmenting underneath the performance. Real alignment, Jung discovered, had nothing to do with how spiritual you looked or how enlightened you felt. It showed up in specific measurable ways that most people on spiritual paths completely missed because they were too busy chasing the feeling of alignment instead of recognizing the actual state. And these markers, the ones Jung identified as proof of genuine psychological and spiritual integration, often made people look less aligned to outside observers, not more. Today I'm going to show you the actual signs Jung identified that indicate genuine alignment right now, why most spiritual practitioners are measuring the wrong things entirely, and how to distinguish between performed alignment and the real integration that changes everything about how you experience reality. Because if you've been on a spiritual path and something feels off about how you're supposed to measure progress, Jung would tell you to trust that instinct. The confusion you're feeling might be the first sign you're actually getting aligned. Jung's investigation into spiritual alignment started with a question that made his colleagues uncomfortable. A patient would arrive having done everything right according to spiritual teaching. Years of meditation, energy work, shadow exploration, consciousness practices. They could speak fluently about chakras and vibration and manifestation. But Jung would look at them and see someone deeply misaligned. Their spiritual practice had become another layer of persona, another performance, another way to avoid actually facing themselves. So Jung started tracking what genuine alignment actually looked like when it happened, not what people claimed about their spiritual state, not how peaceful or positive they appeared, but what changed structurally in their psychology, their behavior, their relationship to reality. And he found markers that were so consistent, so specific, that he could identify real alignment versus spiritual performance within minutes of observation. The first thing Jung noticed about genuinely aligned people was something that disturbed everyone around them. They'd stopped trying to fix themselves, not because they'd reached perfection, not because they had transcended their humanity, but because they'd integrated to the point where they recognized that the impulse to constantly fix themselves was itself a form of misalignment, a rejection of what is in favor of some imagined ideal. This looked like giving up to people who didn't understand. Family members would ask why they'd stopped going to therapy or attending workshops or reading self-help books. Other spiritual seekers would wonder why they weren't working on themselves anymore. But Jung recognized this as the clearest sign that integration had occurred. The person had moved from self-improvement as avoidance to self-acceptance as reality. They still grew, they still changed, but it happened organically from living, not from this compulsive drive to be different than they were. They had stopped treating themselves as a project to complete and started experiencing themselves as a process to live. And that shift from fixing to being was the first marker Jung identified as proof of genuine alignment. The second marker was even more unsettling to observers. Aligned people had developed the capacity to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. They could be angry and compassionate simultaneously, could want connection while choosing solitude, could feel grief and gratitude in the same moment, could hold their shadow and their light without trying to transcend one for the other. Jung called this the integration of opposites, and he found it was completely absent in people performing spiritual alignment. Those people were always trying to get to the right feeling, the correct state, the highest vibration. If they felt anger, they'd work to transmute it to love. If they experienced fear, they'd try to shift to trust. They were constantly managing their internal states to align with spiritual ideals. But genuinely aligned people had stopped this internal warfare. They'd recognized that all states were valid, all emotions were information, all contradictions were part of being human. They didn't need to be only light. They didn't need to transcend their darkness. They'd integrated enough to hold complexity without collapsing into it or trying to escape from it. This made them confusing to be around. You couldn't pin them down as optimistic or pessimistic, positive or negative, spiritual or practical. They were all of it, depending on what the moment required. And that fluidity, that capacity to access the full range of human experience without getting stuck in any particular state, was Jung's second marker of real alignment. The third sign Jung documented was the disappearance of spiritual identity. The person had stopped identifying as spiritual, stopped announcing their practices, stopped using spiritual language to describe their experience. Not because they'd abandoned their path, but because the path had integrated so completely that it no longer needed to be performed or proclaimed. Jung found this pattern shocking because it was the opposite of what spiritual communities reinforced. In those spaces, people's spiritual identity became more pronounced the longer they practiced. They spoke more about consciousness, used more spiritual terminology, referenced their practices more frequently. They were becoming spiritually identified. But genuinely aligned, people moved in the opposite direction. The spiritual framework had done its work and dissolved into how they lived, rather than how they talked about living. They didn't need to announce they were conscious because consciousness had become their default state. They didn't reference their meditation practice because presence had integrated into their daily experience. This created an interesting problem. These people often became invisible to spiritual communities because they had stopped performing the markers that those communities recognized as spiritual advancement. They looked ordinary. They spoke plainly. They didn't radiate the obvious spiritual person energy. But Jung could see that this ordinariness was actually the highest integration, the point where the spiritual and the mundane had merged so completely that you couldn't separate them anymore. The fourth marker was relationship to suffering. Jung observed that genuinely aligned people had a completely different response to pain than people performing alignment. The performers tried to transcend suffering, rise above it, use spiritual concepts to bypass it. They'd quote teachings about how pain is an illusion, or suffering is resistance, or everything happens for your growth. But aligned people had dropped all of that. When they suffered, they suffered. They didn't try to make it mean something, didn't rush to find the lesson, didn't spiritualize it into some higher purpose. They allowed pain to be pain, without needing to transform it into something more palatable or meaningful. This honesty about suffering was what separated real alignment from spiritual performance. The aligned person could say, "This is devastating, and I can't find meaning in it," without feeling like they'd failed spiritually. They'd integrated enough to know that not all pain has a purpose. Not all suffering teaches something valuable, and sometimes life is just brutally difficult without any redemptive quality. And paradoxically, Jung found that this willingness to be with suffering, without spiritualizing it, actually allowed people to move through pain more completely than those trying to transcend it, because they weren't adding the extra layer of spiritual pressure on top of the actual difficulty. They could grieve without performing gratitude, could rage without forcing forgiveness, could be broken without pretending to be grateful for the breaking. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. The fifth sign of genuine alignment Jung identified was the person's relationship to other people's consciousness. Performers felt compelled to wake everyone up, to share what they had learned, to help others see what they were seeing. They experienced their own awareness as something that needed to be transmitted, taught, spread. But aligned people had completely dropped this missionary impulse. They had recognized that consciousness unfolds in its own timing, and their awareness didn't create responsibility for anyone else's journey. They could see someone operating from deep unconsciousness and feel no need to enlighten them, could witness denial without needing to shatter it, could recognize patterns without pointing them out. This looked like not caring to people who didn't understand, but Jung saw it as profound respect for everyone's individual path. The aligned person had integrated enough to know that their clarity about someone else's patterns didn't give them permission to intervene. That seeing someone's unconsciousness clearly didn't obligate them to try to wake that person up. That their alignment was for them, not a tool to be used on others. This created natural boundaries that spiritual performers struggled with. Because if you're identified with being conscious, you feel responsible for raising consciousness around you. But if you're actually aligned, you recognize that your consciousness is your business and everyone else's is theirs. You can offer support when asked. You can share if someone's genuinely ready. But you don't carry this burden of needing to enlighten everyone you encounter. The sixth marker was relationship to certainty. Jung observed that people performing spiritual alignment became increasingly certain about reality. They'd found their teaching, their practice, their understanding, and they knew this was the truth. They spoke with absolute conviction about how consciousness works, what happens after death, how the universe operates. But genuinely aligned people had moved into deep uncertainty, not confusion, not doubt that undermined them, but a profound humility about how much they didn't know and couldn't know. They'd integrated enough to recognize that every framework is partial. Every teaching is limited. Every understanding is incomplete. This uncertainty made them seem less spiritually advanced to people seeking gurus and absolute answers. But Jung recognized it as the most mature spiritual state, the point where you've integrated enough to know that reality is far more mysterious and complex than any teaching can capture. You hold your understanding lightly. You're willing to be wrong. You recognize that your clarity about certain things doesn't extend to knowing everything. Jung found this marker particularly reliable because spiritual ego always moves towards certainty and dogma. The more inflated someone's spiritual identity, the more convinced they become that they've figured it out. But real alignment moves toward mystery and unknowing. The more integrated you become, the more you realize you're just scratching the surface of understanding consciousness and reality. The seventh sign Jung documented was what happened to the person's energy in social situations. Performers radiated this obvious spiritual energy. They projected peace, love, light. They worked to hold space, raise vibration, transmute density. Their presence was noticeably spiritual, but aligned people's energy was neutral in a way that confused people seeking that obvious spiritual presence. They weren't trying to affect the room, weren't working to shift the energy, weren't projecting any particular vibration. They were just present without agenda. This neutrality came from having no need to prove their alignment or demonstrate their consciousness. They weren't performing spirituality, so there was no spiritual energy to project. They could enter a space and simply be there without trying to transform it, or hold it, or manage it. And this actually made them more genuinely present than people working to project high vibration, because they dropped all the effort of spiritual performance. Jung observed that this neutral presence often made genuinely aligned people seem less special than spiritual performers. They didn't have that noticeable glow or obvious energy, but they had something more valuable, actual presence without agenda. They could be with people exactly as those people were without trying to shift them, heal them, or raise their vibration. The eighth marker was the disappearance of spiritual practices as compensation. Jung found that people performing alignment used practices to manage their internal states. They meditated to feel peaceful, did energy work to stay high vibe, practiced gratitude to avoid negative thoughts. The spiritual practice was a tool for maintaining the performance. But aligned people's relationship to practice had transformed completely. If they still practiced, it wasn't to fix anything or achieve any state. It was more like breathing, just part of how they lived. And if they stopped practicing entirely, their alignment didn't collapse because it had never been dependent on the practice. The practice had been a vehicle that brought them to integration, but the integration itself didn't require constant maintenance through spiritual performance. This terrified people who were using practice as identity. Because if you can be aligned without daily meditation, without elaborate rituals, without constant spiritual work, what does that mean about all the effort you're putting in? But Jung saw clearly that this was the natural progression. Practice serves integration. Once integration occurs, the relationship to practice changes. It might continue, but it's no longer needed as proof of alignment or maintenance of spiritual identity. The ninth sign Jung identified was the person's relationship to spiritual community. Performers needed community, needed to be around other conscious people, needed the validation of being recognized as spiritually advanced. They built identity around being part of the awakened ones. But aligned people had often become isolated from spiritual communities because they had outgrown the need for that validation. They could appreciate spiritual connection, but they didn't need it to maintain their alignment. They were okay being the only conscious person in a room of unconscious people, because their integration didn't depend on external recognition or reinforcement. This isolation wasn't lonely for them, in the way it would be for performers, because they'd integrated enough to be complete within themselves. They didn't need others to reflect back their spiritual identity because they dropped spiritual identity entirely. They could connect deeply with anyone, regardless of that person's consciousness level, because they weren't trying to find themselves in others anymore. Jung noted this marker was particularly painful for spiritual communities to witness because it meant their most integrated members often left. Not with drama or denouncements, they just quietly moved on because the community no longer served their growth. And the community interpreted this as falling away, rather than recognizing it as the natural progression of someone who'd completed the work the community was designed to support. The 10th marker Jung documented was the person's relationship to their past self. Performers felt superior to who they'd been before awakening. They'd talk about their old self with disdain or pity. Look at photographs of themselves before their spiritual journey with embarrassment. They had created a division between enlightened now self and ignorant past self. But aligned people had integrated their entire history without judgment. They recognized that every version of themselves had been doing the best they could with the consciousness available at the time. They didn't feel superior to their past self. They felt compassion for the journey that person was on without knowing where it led. This integration of past self was crucial because it indicated the person had stopped using spirituality to reject parts of their own experience. They weren't trying to transcend who they'd been. They'd embraced the whole journey, including the unconscious years, the mistakes, the times they caused harm or operated from wounds they couldn't yet see. Jung observed that this compassion for past self naturally extended to compassion for others' unconsciousness. If you can hold your own previous ignorance with gentleness, you can extend that same gentleness to people currently operating from where you used to be. But if you use your spiritual growth to feel superior to your past self, you'll use it to feel superior to others. And that superiority is proof that the alignment is performed, not integrated. The 11th sign was relationship to comfort and discomfort. People performing alignment were constantly managing their comfort level, avoiding situations that felt heavy or negative, protecting their energy from difficult people or environments, curating their experience to maintain high vibration. But aligned people had developed capacity to be uncomfortable without it threatening their equilibrium. They could sit with someone in crisis without absorbing the crisis or needing to fix it. Could engage with difficult material without needing to immediately cleanse or protect themselves. Could be in environments that weren't high vibe without losing their center. This capacity came from integration deep enough that their alignment wasn't dependent on external conditions. They weren't aligned because they'd created a perfect bubble of spiritual comfort. They were aligned in their core, which meant they could move through any environment without their integration being compromised. Jung found this marker particularly reliable because spiritual performance is inherently fragile. It requires constant maintenance of optimal conditions. But real alignment is robust. It holds in difficulty. It remains intact in crisis. It doesn't collapse when conditions aren't ideal. The aligned person can be in chaos without becoming chaotic, can be around unconsciousness without becoming unconscious, can engage difficulty without losing themselves. The 12th marker Jung identified was the person's relationship to being misunderstood. Performers needed to be seen accurately. They'd explain themselves, defend their perspective, work to make sure people understood who they really were. Being misunderstood felt threatening because their identity depended on being recognized as conscious, spiritual, evolved. But aligned people had become completely okay with being misunderstood. They recognize that everyone perceives through their own lens, and most people wouldn't see them accurately. And this didn't bother them because they weren't seeking validation through being understood. They knew who they were. They didn't need anyone else to know it. This created an interesting paradox. The more aligned someone became, the less they cared if anyone recognized their alignment. They weren't trying to demonstrate it, weren't seeking acknowledgement of it, weren't bothered when people misread them as unspiritual, unconscious, or ordinary. They'd integrated enough to be okay being invisible. Jung observed that this was the final marker, when someone had stopped needing their alignment to be seen or validated by anyone, because at that point, the alignment had become so intrinsic to who they were that external recognition was irrelevant. They were aligned for themselves, not for anyone's acknowledgement of it. What Jung ultimately discovered about genuine alignment was that it looked nothing like what spiritual communities celebrated. The aligned person often seemed less spiritual, less obviously conscious, less performatively enlightened than people in the early stages of spiritual practice, because they'd moved beyond needing to demonstrate their alignment into actually living it so completely that it became invisible. This created a problem for people trying to measure their own progress, because if genuine alignment doesn't look spiritual, doesn't feel constantly peaceful, doesn't require constant practice, how do you know if you're actually aligned or just giving up? Jung's answer was simple but profound. You know you're genuinely aligned when you've stopped asking that question, when you've stopped measuring your spiritual state against any ideal, when you're no longer trying to be aligned and are just being yourself completely, integrating all parts, holding all contradictions, accepting all states, living without the need to be anything other than exactly what you are in each moment. That's alignment, not the performance of spirituality, not the achievement of some enlightened state, not the constant high vibration, but the profound ordinariness of being completely yourself without apology, defense, or need for validation. Jung called this individuation, becoming wholly yourself, and he recognized it as the only genuine spiritual alignment that exists. If you're reading these markers and recognizing them in yourself, Jung would tell you something that might surprise you. Stop measuring. Stop checking if you're aligned. Stop trying to know for certain, because the moment you've integrated enough to recognize these patterns, the question of whether you're aligned becomes irrelevant. You're just living, and that's the point. The spiritual marketplace wants to sell you alignment as something you achieve and then maintain through constant practice and vigilance. But Jung discovered that real alignment is what happens when you stop trying to achieve it and start being it. When the spiritual path has done its work so completely that you forget you're on a path, because you've become the walking itself. That's where you're headed if these markers are showing up, not toward some enlightened destination, but toward the profound simplicity of being yourself so completely that there's nothing left to perform, nothing left to prove, nothing left to become. Just this, just you, just now. Aligned not with some spiritual ideal, but with the reality of what is. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.